So we continue on in our exploration of the decades. And every month we're looking at Indigenous connections, church life in the context of Canada's life, one publication that the church wanted people to read, and we'll sing a hymn from that era. The decade from 1965 to 75 was a time of revolution and upending the present structures. Everything was up for critique and change. From church to politics, school to music, fashion, haircuts, cultural norms, how to voice protest, everything was in flux. It was the beginning of the women's liberation movement, seeking to open opportunities for the participation and the just treatment of women. It involved demanding equality and opportunity for education and employment and compensation. It tackled women's representation in the media, from advertising to dress, from accessing childcare to ending violence against women. The women's movement was also central in campaigns in support of peace and disarmament. In this era, women sought control over their own bodies and fertility, and campaigned for access to birth control and safe medical abortions. The United Church supported the right of women to have access to safe abortions that were covered by provincial health care. But the church also advocated for better access to contraception, sexual education, and counseling that might eventually make abortion unnecessary. In this era, Lois Wilson was ordained as a minister in the United Church. She had studied theology and graduated along with her husband Roy years before, but she did it in an era when married women were not allowed to be ordained, not allowed to be ministers. So she was in the first wave of married women ordained in the church. There were waves of other liberation movements and justice movements going on. Farm workers and the Great Boycott in the United States protested the inhumane treatment and working conditions of seasonal fruit workers. It led to a 5-year strike and a boycott of table grapes that eventually allowed farm workers some protection under the law and awakened the world and the church to the power of collective action. Cesar Chavez in California led Filipino and Latino workers in non-violent protest. But not all revolutions at the time were non-violent. The Front de Libération du Québec, the FLQ, sought Quebec independence. In 1970, they set off a series of bombs, collected dynamite and weapons, kidnapped James Cross, a British ambassador, and the Quebec Justice Minister, Pierre Laporte. They intended to use them as hostages to bargain for the release of 23 FLQ members serving time in federal penitentiaries for robbery, murder, bombings, and other violent crimes. The Canadian government refused to negotiate. Pierre Trudeau's government declared the War Measures Act that allowed warrantless searches and arrests. They recovered huge stores of dynamite, weapons, and arrested nearly 500 people. Cross was released unharmed, but Laporte was strangled and left in the trunk of a car in Montreal. In this October crisis, Canada was deeply divided. Even though about 85% of Canadians and Quebecers supported the use of the War Measures Act, a vocal minority denounced it as overreach. In America, there was a revolution for social justice and equality among the races, a fight that played out in schools, diners, buses, public spaces, and voting booths. It was designed and led to be a non-violent revolution. It involved people across racial lines, religious lines, generational lines, and gender lines. Civil rights were at the center of American life and politics. But it came with a heavy price to pay in the streets, as violent reaction to change played out in neighborhoods and in the very lives of the leaders of the movement. The biggest voices at the heart of the civil rights movement would be silenced in this decade by assassins. Martin Luther King Jr. and Bobby Kennedy, both dead only 2 months apart. The hope and despair of Americans of all races reverberated around the world. In Vancouver, the Black population was considerably smaller, but lived with its own struggles for equality and justice. It was a community mostly made up of American refugees from the Civil War 100 years earlier, who found it difficult to live in the States. There were also a good number of Black farmers who came from Alberta, and porters who worked on the cross-country trains. Black citizens of Vancouver gathered in places where visible minorities could afford housing and where they would be welcomed in the neighborhood. Nestled between Chinatown and the Italian section of town and close to the train station, a little community of Strathcona grew up. It contained homes and businesses of predominantly Black population in the city. Though it was a poor neighborhood and was often the source of debate at City Hall for urban renewal, it was home to music, culture, and food life unique to its residents. Jimi Hendrix's grandmother lived there. Yes, there were some gamblers and bootleggers and brothels, but most of the residents were just regular people trying to get by. The common thread was that they didn't have much money, whether they were Italian, Chinese, Black, or Indigenous, or Japanese. Its unofficial name was Hogan's Alley, and in its heyday, it was a vibrant place, but by the 60s and 70s, it was just allowed to go to rack and ruin. Beginning in '67, the city of Vancouver began leveling the area to make way for a freeway, the Georgia Viaduct, spelling the end of the neighborhood. Since that time, there has not been a viable, identifiable Black neighborhood in the city. During this decade, the war in Vietnam was grinding on with horrific pictures from the theater of battle and a continuous stream of casualties and coffins returning to the United States. The corruption of Nixon's administration was made public, and an estimated 50,000 young American men made their way to Canada to protest their government's actions and to avoid the draft. The United Church at the time offered emergency aid to people fleeing the United States. But despite the tensions and the violence and the turmoil of the time, there was such a powerful and positive youth revolution, led by young people who envisioned a world of peace and love and freedom. The flower children were born, stepping away from the constraints and conventions of their parents' generation. In San Francisco, they dubbed 1967 the Summer of Love, as 100,000 young people, hippies, beatniks, musicians, and countercultural leaders made their way to be together. And the movement came north to Vancouver. I don't know if any of you were the person with the hair in the picture. There were sit-ins and love-ins and be-ins everywhere. Hippies took over Stanley Park with a be-in, with phrases like make love, not war, and burn pot, not people. They ushered in their own Canadian Summer of Love, much to the dismay of a rather buttoned-down Vancouver population. And 2 years later, of course, the huge music festival Woodstock attracted the world's bands and fans. The Cultural Revolution changed the face of institutions, particularly those places where young people gathered. Schools changed from disciplined rows of students facing blackboards in the early 60s to learning pods, table groups, hangout corners, beanbag chairs, and the rap sessions of the 70s. All rules were being redefined, and teachers in that decade had no idea what hit them. And while everything else was being liberated, so was the telephone. No longer required to be wired into the wall of the house, the promise was that you would be able to take it anywhere you wanted to go. It wouldn't be available for purchase for another 10 years and would cost about $10,000. So it was more of a technological experiment than a practical help. But really, how many people would need or want a mobile phone? And if you're thinking about things that weren't useful at the time, the service book of the United Church of Canada probably fell into this category. It was a hard-covered book filled with prayers and responses for services of worship. Has anyone seen this book? A few? It was to be available in the pews along with the hymn book, the Bible, and the service book, so that people could have everything they needed at hand to participate in worship. The content of the book was good, but it went out of date quickly. And with everything moving so fast in the culture, clergy and congregations balked at being tied to standardized prayers and liturgies. They wanted to be more nimble. So not a lot of churches purchased these books. But that doesn't mean the church wasn't changing fast. Guitars and drums and keyboards found their way into churches that traditionally had only one sacred instrument, the organ. In some cases, it changed the way that the United Church people worshiped as they incorporated new music and new sounds into their liturgy. Some churches developed two very distinct services. One that tended to attract the young and those with children. It often involved guitars, modern music, and sometimes a coffeehouse vibe with conversation and film and lots of participation. And for the older, more traditional crowd, or people seeking a quieter experience, historical hymns, traditional preaching, and organ music. In lots of cases, even though people attended the same church, people were loyal to their own service time, and they rarely met the other group. Even the Bible was having a new look and sound. Most Christians had grown up hearing or reading the version of the Bible commissioned in 1611 by King James of England, with all the thees and the thous and begats and whither thou goest. It was beautiful and poetic, and like Shakespeare, pretty hard to understand on your own. So in the 50s, a revised standard version was published of the Bible and used in most Protestant churches. It was written to be scholarly and scrupulously accurate to the original texts, but tended to be a bit dry. But in this decade, a new Bible was released. It was called Good News for Modern Man. Written in easily understandable and accessible language, It was filled with beautiful, simple line drawings of the stories contained within the covers. It was a fresh and welcome addition to Bible studies for people of all ages. Our understanding of mission was also undergoing huge renovation. There was a changing face of Indigenous ministries. In this time, the Canadian government ended church participation in the residential schools. But the church continued to be involved with hospitals, mission boats, and congregations in Indigenous communities. These communities wanted not to be an object of the church's missionary zeal, but rather partners in the spiritual life that was a gift of the Creator. They urged the church to move from a mindset of mission to partnership. Incredible Indigenous leaders rose up across the country. In BC, names like Alvin Dixon and Alberta Billy were rising as leaders in the United Church and in their communities to restore dignity and offer respect and hope to their people. They also wanted the wider church to learn from them. They brought teachings from their own traditions. They wanted culturally familiar symbols and practices in worship and in pastoral care, and they wanted to train Indigenous leadership in the church. 40 years earlier, the United Church had started with over 1,000 missionaries throughout Canada and across the globe. This decade began to change how we worked with people in all the places the church sought to be of service. We were learning to listen and share and support rather than coming in with all the answers. We were moving from mission to partnership. And even Jesus was changing. The images from the 1940s and 50s, embraced by Protestant churches all across North America, showed a perfect, serene, and shining Jesus, the work of Swedish immigrant Warner Salmon. In this era, Salmon's Jesus was accompanied, but not replaced, by a more tussled, approachable, and sun-kissed Jesus, depicted by artist Richard Hook. And some of you will remember this. A United Church artist named Willis Wheatley depicted Jesus Christ, Liberator, or as some people called it, the Laughing Christ. It was met with a mixed response. It was scandalous, joyful, undignified, unserious, approachable, free. It was, in fact, just like the decade. Jesus was also making it big on Broadway, in rock operas and in some of the big movies of the decade. First, it was a hippie presentation of Jesus Christ Superstar. It was filmed in Israel, in the home of the stories of Jesus. Jerusalem, the Dead Sea, Beersheba, Nazareth, and the West Bank. Everyone knew the music. And seeing a modern Jesus walk and sing in those ancient and familiar places was powerful. And then the story was told again in New York City setting, with clowns and metaphors in the rock opera Godspell. The culture of this decade wanted the story of Jesus. They wanted to hear of the hope and suffering, the injustice and the love. They wanted Jesus, but without the traditional and historical wrappings in which he had previously been offered. Music was at the heart of this decade. Songs sung at protests, coffee houses, churches, parks, and marches. Bryn and I chose one that reaffirmed the heart of the Christian message of that era, and the message that this decade so longed to share. It was the message of love.